So please join me in welcoming Amy Goodman.
As Michael brings back that story from some 25 years ago, it brought back an image I had in being able to really talk to people on all sides in the West Bank and Gaza, because I happened to have been mugged right before I went there in the streets of New York. So my face was sliced up. The doctor said he would quit if I dared go to the occupied territories, because I had to heal back in New York. Needless to say, I didn't have that doctor for long, so I went, and I had to wear a big hat to cover all the stitches on my face. And when I would go to the Palestinians to speak to them, they would say, "We're so sorry, did the Israeli military get here?" When I would go to the Israeli military to speak to them, they would say, "We're so sorry, did the Palestinians get here?" So I got some heart-rending responses on both sides. But it is great to be here as we're driving in. We were hearing about the teachers' strike being suspended, and I look forward to hearing the teachers speak after to tell us exactly what has happened. And on Democracy Now! Tomorrow we hope to be interviewing Karen Lewis, the president of the Chicago Teachers Union. As we travel this country, it is truly amazing everywhere we go. We were in Pennsylvania dealing with the issue of voting rights, the legislation that's being introduced around the country. Their legislation has been passed that could lead to the disenfranchisement of close to 1 million people. To show how significant that is, Barack Obama won in Pennsylvania by 600,000 people. This could disenfranchise anywhere between 750,000 and 1 million. And it's not about who you're voting for, but just having the right to vote. Particularly interesting as we traveled from Charlotte, North Carolina, covering the Republican convention first in Tampa and then the Democrats in Charlotte. Because in Charlotte, I went to the Levine Museum for the New South and sort of traveled through a century of history in North Carolina. One of the first places of the lunch counter sit-ins, you know, in Greensboro, the Woolworth sit-in inspired the Johnson C. Smith Historically Black College in Charlotte students to come to the lunch counters there. That was the civil rights movement at the time. Before that, after Reconstruction, what happened in North Carolina was quite amazing. The progressive forces, African American and poor white farmers were the majority of the state legislature. This so threatened the establishment elite, and this shows the power of the media. The establishment elite that was led by the media in North Carolina, the Charlotte Observer in Charlotte and the Raleigh News and Observer in Raleigh-Durham. The Raleigh News and Observer, the publisher, was the former Secretary of the Navy, Josephus Daniels. And they basically laid the foundation for Jim Crow and forced out this legislature as they started to impose, pushing for the media kind of manufacturing consent, as Noam Chomsky says, for literacy taxes, for literacy tests, poll taxes. And we all know how destructive Jim Crow was. Now, these two newspapers recently took responsibility for what they did. They did an investigative series about how destructive their newspapers were in this, and then issued an apology. This is the power of the media when it is used as a weapon of war. I believe the media media can be used is the greatest force for peace on earth, as a forum to find common ground for people to speak for themselves. But that history, quite remarkable in Charlotte, and so then you see these laws that are being passed around the country, and you can't help but think about the poll taxes and the literacy tests. In Pennsylvania, we went from that to the case of Terrence Williams, who is scheduled to be executed in Pennsylvania, the first person in about 40 years who, there were 3 who in that period who did not contest their execution, but for anyone who contested it, there hasn't been an execution in 40 years. He does not, his lawyers admit that he did commit the murder, but that he murdered his rapist. And this has brought together all sorts of forces in Pennsylvania asking that his sentence be commuted, that he be taken off of death row. He's scheduled to die on October 3rd. And finally, we looked at the issue of fracking in Pennsylvania and Ohio and Michigan, a very big issue. And each state is a microcosm. It is so interesting. And the mentioning of Troy Anthony Davis brings us back to a year ago. We're on this 100-city tour. We went back to New York Sunday night and Monday for the first anniversary of Occupy Wall Street, because that was such a pivotal moment of forces coming together of every different strength. Now, the corporate media use that to attack the protests and say, what do these people represent? Everyone's got a different concern. I actually think that was part of its strength. If there's only one issue raised, they would have just ripped that apart. It was much more difficult, not to mention the fact that they didn't have one appointed reader, but it was so decentralized. But think about that time a year ago. We were just coming off of the summer where 1,200 people were arrested as they made a ring around the Rose Garden in Washington. Environmentalists protesting President Obama in trying to encourage him not to sign on to the XL tar sands pipeline. And then people came to New York, and many of the signs on that day, on September 17th, that people were carrying into Zuccotti Park were about Troy Anthony Davis. They said, I am Troy Davis, I am Troy Davis. That was September 17th. On September 20th, we went down to Atlanta, and on September 21st, we were in Jackson, Georgia, at the death row prison, where Troy Davis was scheduled to die. He didn't know what would happen. He had had 3 death warrants issued before, some coming within minutes of his execution, but then it was put off. We decided we would broadcast that night, no matter what happened. Dennis is giving out the daily digest that lets you keep in touch with us, and we send you our daily headlines and our news alerts. And by the way, if you'd like Democracy Now! To come to Chicago, you can ask your public radio or television station to broadcast Democracy Now! We are thrilled to be on CAN TV live every morning. Every morning at 7 o'clock on Evanston Television as well. We were on some community radio stations here that have since folded, we're very sorry to say. But what we're thrilled about is that at this point, we're broadcasting over 1,100 stations around the country and around the world, increasingly on PBS and NPR stations throughout the country. We deeply believe in public media and in supporting public media, whether it's public access TV or college or community radio, Pacifica Radio, NPR. We need to preserve the public spaces. So we went down to Jackson, Georgia to broadcast, not knowing what would happen. If we could have been in the execution chamber, we would have, because I feel it's absolutely critical to be there on the scene, to broadcast whatever it is that is happening, and then you make your decision about what is done in your name. 150 people were allowed in a protest pen on the grounds of the prison. and then 1,000 people were across the street. Students had marched from Morehouse College and Spelman College holding candles, 1,000 people across the way. The family of Troy Anthony Davis, the heads of Amnesty International and the NAACP were in the protest pen. And when we came up, the group of the Democracy Now! Team, the prison guards said we could not go near the pen, we'd have to broadcast across the way. I looked at the other media, because there were other trucks there, and asked why they weren't asking to come forward, and we weren't going to do a 6-hour broadcast just speaking to ourselves. I mean, to talk to the people who were there was what was most important, but they were probably doing stand-ups of 30 seconds to a minute, and so it wasn't as important to them. But we wanted to know why people would have come from across the country. We wanted to talk to the families and the human rights leaders throughout that evening. When our truck came, that might have been hired by Fox the next day or CNN the day before, the guys who drove the broadcast truck onto the grounds were bigger than the prison guards. And when they came on the site, they said, "Where do you want this truck?" I said, "Well, the guards have said," they said, "No, where do you want this truck?" I said, "I want it right over there, right next to them." And they drove up, and the guards parted the way, and that's where we set up. And it was quite astounding. We started the broadcast at 6 o'clock, 6 o'clock in the afternoon, Georgia time. How many of you know Troy Anthony Davis's case? But just to briefly explain it, he was sentenced to death for the murder of an off-duty Savannah police officer named Mark McPhail in 1989. 7 of the 9 non-police witnesses later recanted or changed their testimony, some alleging police intimidation for their original false statements. One who did not recant was the man who many have named as the actual killer. No physical evidence linked Davis to the shooting. Troy Anthony Davis was one of more than 3,200 prisoners on death row in the United States. He had faced 3 prior execution dates, with each one global awareness group. Amnesty International picked up his case, so did the NAACP. Calls for clemency came from Pope Benedict, former FBI Director William Sessions, former Republican Georgia Congressman Bob Barr. The Georgia State Board of Pardons and Paroles, in granting a stay of execution in 2007, wrote it will not allow an execution to proceed in the state unless there's no doubt as to the guilt of the accused. Alan Alt, the former warden of this death row prison, joined with, who was not opposed to the death penalty, but opposed to Troy Anthony Davis being executed, joined with 5 other retired wardens in calling for a stay of the execution of Troy Anthony Davis. So the chorus of calls for that indicated, well, maybe this execution would be put off. We got the press packet from the Department of Corrections, what this case was about. Interestingly, it was very thin, and it mainly focused on what Troy Anthony Davis would be fed for dinner. It was very specific on this point. It said he would be having grilled cheeseburgers, oven-browned potatoes, baked beans, coleslaw cookies, and a great beverage. It also listed the lethal cocktail that would follow: pentobarbital, pancuronium bromide, potassium chloride, and Ativan, in parentheses, a sedative. The pentobarbital anesthetizes, the pancuronium bromide paralyzes, and the potassium chloride stops the heart. Davis refused the sedative and the Last Supper. By 7 p.m., the U.S. Supreme Court was reportedly reviewing Davis's plea for a stay. The case was referred to Supreme Court Justice Clarence Thomas, who hails from Pinpoint, Georgia, a community founded by freed slaves that's near Savannah, where Davis had lived. The Supreme Court, as we waited through the evening, ultimately denied the plea. Davis's execution began at 10:53 p.m. A prison spokesperson delivered the news to the reporters outside. Time of death, 11:08 p.m. The eyewitnesses to the execution stepped out. According to an Associated Press reporter who was inside, these were Troy Davis's final words. You know, He was strapped to a gurney that looks like a cross. His arms strapped to the strap. His arms were strapped down. His legs were strapped down. And he, at the last minute, they pull the curtain back and they show the people, the witnesses who are there. He turned to Mark MacPhail's family, and he said, "I'd like to address the MacPhail family, let you know, despite the situation you're in, I'm not the one who personally killed your son, your father, your brother. I am innocent. The incident that happened that night is not my fault. I did not have a gun. All I can ask is you look deeper into this case so that you really can finally see the truth." And then he turned to his two lawyers, his friends. "I ask my family and friends to continue to fight this fight." And then he turned to his executioners and said, "For those about to take my life, God have mercy on your souls, and may God bless your souls." The state of Georgia took Davis's body to Atlanta for an autopsy, charging his family for the transportation. On Troy Davis's death certificate, the cause of death is listed simply as homicide. As I stood on the grounds of the prison just after Troy Davis was executed, it was about 1:45. The Department of Corrections threatened to pull the plug on our broadcast. The show was over. I was reminded what Gandhi reportedly answered when asked what he thought of Western civilization. He responded, "I think it would be a good idea." That was part of what fueled Occupy Wall Street a year ago. When you think about that time, how the corporate media operated, first for days they didn't even report on it. And then they ridiculed it. I remember Erin Burnett was just starting her show on CNN, and she had done an interview the night before on CNN to explain how she was going to give voice to the people, and her first segment of the first show had the segment "Seriously?" But again, it made me think about Mahatma Gandhi, who said, first they ignore you, then they laugh at you, then they fight you, then you win. And no matter how you feel about Occupy, there is no question it has changed this country and changed the world. I mean, any Madison Avenue PR exec would drool to be the one who came up with the motto, "We are the 99%. And the word occupy is known all over the world, even in English, occupy. Movements are what matter. Movements are what make the difference. I wanted to talk about going to the Republican and Democratic conventions this time around. I was a little nervous about going first to the convention in Tampa because of what happened 4 years ago when we were covering the conventions in Denver and St. Paul. We had covered the Denver convention, there was mass protests there, and then we flew to St. Paul, and that's where my colleagues and I got arrested on the first day of the Republican convention, simply trying to bring out the voices of people who were outside and inside. And let me just explain that, because I think it goes to a bigger point that I'm deeply concerned about, which is the militarization of the police in this country, something that we should not be accepting. And good police officers and police chiefs feel exactly the same way, that what we've seen since 9/11, the billions of dollars that has been poured into local police departments. They're buying tanks, they're buying drones, the level of surveillance is unprecedented. It's not good for a democratic society. Dissent is what this country was founded on. Dissent is what will save us. So when we covered the Democratic Convention of 2008, there was a lot of protests. We flew to St. Paul, and the protest began immediately. It was the first day of the Republican Convention 2008. It was Labor Day, actually. And they, too, by the way, were concerned about a hurricane then, that it would hit New Orleans. It would look very bad if the Republican Convention were partying when people were in trouble, and so they were having all sorts of meetings. By the way, on this one, you know, the threat in Tampa was that there would be a hurricane, and it was very bad tropical storm. It was pouring rain in Charlotte and in Tampa. And when one of my colleagues at Democracy Now!, Steve Martinez, when I said, my gosh, there's going to be another hurricane, it's going to be in Tampa, he said, is it a legitimate hurricane? And you know, he's referring to Todd Aiken making the comment that, you know, women who are legitimately raped don't get pregnant. So our general manager, Julie Crosby, said, well, not to worry then, because if it's a legitimate hurricane, Tampa will shut down and will allow any more. Back in 2008, Labor Day, 10 o'clock in the morning, beautiful blue sky day. Who knows, maybe some of you were there. And there were delegates who were going inside who were also outside, you know, marching from St. Paul City Hall to the XL Convention Center. It was led by soldiers and some in full military regalia. You know, that is a big untold story as a level of resistance in the military. These are people who know they've been there, or they're refusing to go. And they were marching. Some had served in Iraq and Afghanistan, some had served but refusing to go back, some had refused to serve at all, and then thousands of civilians of every political party and stripe and age walking behind them. And we were covering this. And then my colleagues went to the TV station to prepare the show, digitize tape. I went to the convention floor to interview delegates from the hottest state, from Alaska. You remember 2 days before Sarah Palin had been announced by Senator John McCain. And so I was there interviewing people, and I got a call from our senior producer, Mike Burke, and he said, come quickly, 7th Jackson, Sharif, and Nicole have been arrested and been bloodied by the police. What are you talking about? They're in the TV station. I just left them. This was a totally peaceful protest outside. He said, just get over there. So I was with Rick Rowley of Big Noise Films, who does fantastic films, and I encourage you to see them all. And we raced off the floor of the convention center. Now I have all the top credentials that allow me to interview presidents and vice presidents and delegates, Congress members. And we're racing off the floor onto the streets. We go to 7th and Jackson. We see the riot police that surrounded the area, but it was fully contained. And I went up to one of the officers and I said, you can see I've just come from the convention floor. I've got all the credentials. And so do my colleagues inside. And I understand they've been arrested. I'd like to speak to your commanding officer. We need to have them released. It wasn't seconds before they ripped me through the police line, twisted my arms back, slapped the handcuffs on, threw me against a car, against a wall, and onto the ground, charging me with a misdemeanor, interfering with a peace officer. If only there was a peace officer in the vicinity. So from my vantage point on the ground, I am desperately looking for Sharif and Nicole. Sharif Abelkadus and Nicole Salazar, two of our producers. Now you may know Sharif because of the remarkable job he has done covering the Egyptian Revolution. 2 years later, he would fly home to Egypt. He's an Egyptian American with our video producer, also an Egyptian American who had served on like the Egyptian national basketball team. He leaps tall buildings in a single bound. You need that for a videographer in the middle of Tahrir. And what they brought us from the middle of Tahrir was truly remarkable. I mean, first, Mubarak plunged the country into digital darkness. But we are used to working through these kind of impediments. Democracy Now! Started 16 years ago. We didn't have the money for satellites to send radio, or certainly when we were doing TV as well. We pioneered a way to send broadcast quality video through the internet, and when the internet is down, we have other ways, and Sharif became one of the top tweeters in the world. His tweets were being shown on CNN. He was being interviewed on MSNBC, CNN, and other networks, and of course on Democracy Now! We call that trickle-up journalism. But what he was bringing you, the picture, I remember Anderson Cooper was in his hotel room on Skype looking like the old Democracy Now! When the thugs had brought down the satellites as well. But that's when Mubarak had brought back up the internet. Sharif always joked Mubarak's fatal error was to take down the internet. He said, we're Egyptian after all. We would have been inside on Facebook and on the internet. Now we had to go outside to see what was happening. And so that was the beginning of Tahrir. But when he brought up the internet and the thugs then took down the satellites, the networks, they had the image of Tahrir, which was absolutely amazing. But the voices that we were able to bring you, which we sent through the internet, that Sharif did. I mean, you met Adef Souef, the great Egyptian writer who wrote Map of Love. You met Nawal Sadawi, the 79-year-old psychiatrist, presidential candidate. She had been imprisoned under Sadat. She had been exiled under Mubarak. She had written many books. She had been running these salons telling young people, we will win someday. Even they more skeptical than she was, even though she had been through so much. You met a young high school student who was publishing a broadsheet, Voices of Tahrir, in the shadow of the state media building that had spewed lies for so long. And you heard people speaking for themselves. It wasn't just the bird's eye view, but that was amazing. This was people who could have been in your community. This is the power of independent media. This was the beauty that Sharif brought you. And at night, he would stay in Tahrir, and Hani would make his way back to Sharif's house, and he would put together these remarkable videos and send them through to Democracy Now! For us to broadcast to you the next morning. Sharif was not arrested by Mubarak covering Tahrir, but he was arrested here in the United States covering what was supposed to be a celebration of democracy, party convention. So back to that square, September 1st, 2008. I was looking for Sharif and Nicole, though I was down on the ground, and I did see Sharif across the parking lot with his hands behind his back. I demanded that I be brought to him, and finally the police let me. They brought me over to him. We were standing there, our credentials on, hands behind our back, his arm is bleeding, and we were saying, you must release us. You know that we're journalists, you must release us. Whereupon the Secret Service came and ripped the credentials from around our necks. Then they brought me into the police van, and that's where I saw Nicole. Her face was bleeding, she had her credentials on, she was handcuffed. I said, what happened? She said, we were in the TV studio preparing the show. We heard a commotion outside. We grabbed camera, microphone, raced downstairs. We saw this parking lot. There were some protesters, mainly it was riot police, and she was standing against a car. She was holding her camera, and the riot police came at her in formation. She was against the car. And as they were shouting at her, on your face, on your face. She was shouting back, press, press. She hadn't planned to film her own violent arrest, but that's just what happened. As she shouts back, press, press, they shout on your face, and she didn't know what hit her. From behind and in front of her, they slammed her to the ground. They had knee or boot in her back, and they were pulling on her legs, so they were dragging her face through the ground. The first thing to go down was her camera. They pulled the battery from her camera. If you were wondering what it was, they wanted to stop happening. Now, Sharif is a very cool guy. He told the rioting police to calm down. And they took him, kicked him twice in the chest, threw him against the wall, and took him down, bloodying his arm. They faced PC felony riot charges, probable cause felony riot. So I am taken to the police garage where they've erected cages to put the protesters in. And Sharif and Nicole are taken to jail. The video of our arrest went online immediately. And that's ultimately what freed us. Within a number of hours, I mean, the YouTube video of our arrest was the most watched, went viral, most watched YouTube video in the first 2 days of the convention. I didn't know this was happening as I sat next to the cages, but eventually I was released, and then Nicole and Sharif were released. To show what a difference it makes, Sharif was jailed with the AP photographer. And the AP photographer didn't get out when Sharif got out. There were 40 reporters arrested, and more than 40 reporters arrested that week. So that night, I'm taken to the convention because the networks want to interview me about what happened. And I'm in the NBC skybox. At the end of the interview, the reporter comes over to me, and he says, I don't get it. Why wasn't I arrested? And I said, oh, were you covering the protests outside as well? And he said, no. So I said, well, I don't get arrested in the skybox either. See, as video says, 90% of life is just showing up. We've got to get out there. And that's our job. We've got to be on the convention floor, interview the delegates. There are all sorts of disputes and all sorts of different proposals that are being put forward. People are very interesting from all over the country. You got to get into the corporate suites, and I'll talk about that in just 1 minute. See who's funding these parties, the Democrats and the Republicans. And you got to get out into the streets, where the uninvited guests are, sometimes thousands of them. They have something very important to say as well.
You know, democracy is a messy thing, and it's our job to capture it all, and we shouldn't have to get a record when we put things on the record. So, the next day, the police chief was holding his news conference to talk about how successful the police operation had been and how this will be the model of how they will move forward for the week, which was very alarming to us considering we had a 2-hour daily broadcast to produce. And we had just finished getting Nicole out of the emergency room. The officer who opened the door to the news conference was my processing officer the night before. And I said to him, you not only have to let me into this news conference, you have to let me out when it's done. So at the press conference, journalists were asking questions. I raised my hand, I described what happened to us, and I asked Chief Barrington, I said, what have you instructed your police officers to do? And how do you expect us to operate in this environment? And he said we could embed with the mobile field force, embed with the police mobile field force. Now, the next day I saw a Fox reporter with his Fox baseball cap on in the middle of this moving police organism that's moving down the street. Embed. You understand what he means. You know, like embed with the troops in Iraq and Afghanistan. I'm not saying reporters who do that aren't brave. They are. But I think the embedding process has brought the media to an all-time low. The Pentagon calls it a spectacular success, but that's why it is such a problem. I mean, when you are sleeping with the troops, eating with the troops, when your life is in their hands, how do you expect you're going to cover a war? Then you have to embed with in Iraqi hospitals and Afghan communities and the peace movement around the world to understand the full effects of war. And the idea that this embedding model is the one that's now brought back to the United States, and we are told that's how we must cover American cities and American politics. It's not acceptable. And it's not just a matter of embedding with troops. The problem is embedding with the establishment in Washington. I would go to these news conferences at the White House and, you know, experience the access of people, meaning the reporters who trade truth for access. And it's not acceptable. There's a reason why our profession, journalism, is the only one explicitly protected by the US Constitution, because we're supposed to be the check and balance on power. We are supposed to be holding those in power accountable. My brother David and I have written a few books together. The first one's called The Exception to the Rulers. That's what the media should be. That's our motto at Democracy Now!, the exception to the rulers. The second one's called Static, and the reason we call it that is in this high-tech digital age with high-definition television and digital radio, still all we get is static. That veil of distortion and lies and misrepresentations and half-truths that obscure reality. And what we need the media to give us is a dictionary definition of static: criticism, opposition, unwanted interference. We need a media that covers power, not covers for power. We need a media that is the for the state, not for the state. And we need a media that covers the movements that create static and make history. So, we sued the Twin Cities Police and the Secret Service, and it took us 3 years. The Secret Service demanded to be severed from the case, but we knew that they were involved with this. You know, it's sometimes hard to figure out all these levels of authority and the fusion centers and who is there, and sometimes names are covered and numbers are covered, but it was the police who told us it was the Secret Service. When the police were holding us, you know, I asked the officer, could you please loosen my handcuffs because they were so tight, and he tightened them. And then the man came over and ripped the credentials from around our necks. I turned to the police and I said, you have no right to do this. And he responded, that's not us, that's the Secret Service. So we figured out who it was, and we went through this process. We won a 6-figure settlement, and also the St. Paul Police Department developing a protocol for how to deal with reporters. And we made the announcement of our settlement at the height of the Occupy encampment at Zuccotti Park. because we wanted to send especially a message to police, and we knew that was a place where there were hundreds of police officers, that they would have to pay a price for these unlawful arrests. Yes, of journalists, but also any unlawful arrests. This doesn't increase our national security by any means. And this issue of the militarization of police, you know, we have the Posse Comitatus Act, which I think that people agree is a good thing. We don't want soldiers marching through the streets of the United States, but I feel the way the authorities have gotten around this is by militarizing the police. And you don't have to take my word for it. Norm Stanford, the police chief, former police chief of Seattle, was pushed out because of what he did in the Battle of Seattle. You know, thousands of people protesting the World Trade Organization, a supranational organization that could overturn the laws of democratically elected legislatures. Like if the Chicago City Council said, not even we will ban GMO foods, but let's say they say they want GMO labeling. That could be deemed by another country as an obstacle to trade, and they would call it WTO illegal, and it could overturn the laws of the leaders you represent. So people were protesting, thousands of them. French farmers, high school students with their teachers, environmentalists, union leaders, everyone came together in Seattle. You may remember it was the time, it was what, the second term of President Clinton. Madeleine Albright was weeping in her room because the tear gas was coming under the door. And President Clinton had to come in the middle of the night because of the mass protests, and hundreds of people were arrested, hit with rubber bullets, even as the police were denying it, and CNN was repeating the denials. This is when indie media really blossomed. IndieMedia.org got more hits than CNN.com, just showing the pictures of the rubber bullets. And it was Norm Stanford who says this was the greatest mistake of his career, and he's now one of the greatest spokespeople for demilitarizing the police, saying we are separating ourselves, the police officers are, from people that could be their neighbors, their daughters, their cousins, their people they know. And they're not only moving in with, you know, plastic masks, they're moving in with full body shields, pushing like a wall against people who they may even agree with. And he said this is not the way to deal with dissent in America today. Interestingly, we had Chief Stanford on when we had a spokesperson for the Police Foundation on, because that spokesperson had organized a conference call with something like 18 police chiefs of this country to deal with Occupy, you know, as they were sort of eviscerating the encampments. And the spokesperson said, I want to say what an honor it is to be on with Chief Stanford because we use him as a model. And Norm Stanford said, no, don't use what I did at the Battle of Seattle as a model. Use me as a reverse model. This is not what I feel serves America today. And I think we are just gradually getting used to a level of police reaction that certainly doesn't serve a democracy. I mean, I remember right before Tampa, the Republican convention, hearing on the news that anarchists might be exploding IEDs in the streets of Tampa. And so then you start to justify, well, the $50 million that the Tampa police got and the $50 million that they got in Charlotte. And then there was the $18 million each party got to throw their parties. Interesting, I didn't hear the Republicans complaining about the tens of millions of dollars of government funding that went into throwing that party. And on that issue of debt, inside the convention, the first day the motto was, we built this. And that was, you know, they're mocking President Obama saying, if you've done something successful in this country, built a business, probably government had some role in helping, like if you're a businessman, just building the roads. So each person who got up mocked this theme, but everyone was holding the signs, we built this, we built this. South Carolina Governor Nikki Haley got up, and she talked about how proud she was having Boeing in their state, and how she was there when the first plane was built in South Carolina by Boeing, standing with the non-union workers, she said, celebrating this great American company, she said, and They built this, Boeing built this. I could only think, well, on one side of the room, they had the debt clock going, and it's going fast. Every second, that debt is going up. And they had a second debt clock that they started when they gavelled in the convention to show how rapidly, even in those few days, the debt was going up. And on the other side, they had, we built this. And hearing them talk about Boeing, and I could only think, yes, looking at we built this and looking at the debt, they built that debt. Think about how many billions of dollars of government funding Boeing has gotten. Just the facts. That's all we have to do is provide the facts. And that's what we tried to do through the Republican Convention. Why Mike Burke, our senior producer, and Hani Massoud, who covered the Egyptian Revolution and came back, was walking the halls of the corporate suites. It's our job to get there, see who's funding these conventions. And Mike runs into Sheldon Adelson, the Macau, Vegas casino magnate who's been investigated for bribery and corruption, and who gave Newt Gingrich first millions of dollars, but now is funding the Republican Party, promises to give something like $100 million. This is the first post-Citizens United election, and we have to take this very seriously. So Mike went over to ask him how much money he does plan to spend in this election cycle. And there was a woman standing between them, and she stepped back and body slammed Mike, which threw him back. He hadn't expected this. And Hani is just filming, and Hani's a towering, strong guy, and she then grabbed his camera and ran into the Adelson suite. They didn't know what hit them, so Mike is reaching for his Android phone to document now what had happened since they had their camera taken. And as he's reaching for his phone, the security or the Adelson team is pulling it out of his hand. Now, the Adelson team, if nothing else, is supposed to respect private property, we've heard. And then Hani goes over to the suite to put his foot in the door because this person has stolen his camera, and she drops it on the ground. So they don't even know who this person is, and soon the Adelson team is surrounding them, and then his top spokesperson for the casinos and for the Adelson family comes out and apologizes quickly, gives Mike and Hani his card and says, we'll take care of all of this tomorrow, with anything you want, we'll take care of this, and we're very sorry. And Mike's saying, who is this woman who's just stolen our camera and slammed it on the ground? That's Mr. Adelson's daughter. So this became a little embarrassing for the Adelson family. All the media picked it up, New York Times, this story, all the networks were doing a story on the Adelson family attacked the Democracy Now! Team. And so they put out a press release the next day. They're very, they are nothing if they are not well lawyered up. And it was done very carefully. They knew they could not say that in any way our team had been aggressive at all. All Mike was doing was trying to ask a question. We had the video. That was their problem. And so they wrote that they believed all journalists should be nonviolent, which we agree with. Very careful in how they put this. And then they wished us well, covering the rest of the Republican convention. Well, the next day I went to talk to David Koch. You know who David Koch is. He's the Charles and David Koch are the billionaire oil magnates who fund the Tea Party movement and promised to give something like $400 million in this election. And David Koch happened to be a New York delegate. So this is a little like what the Tampa Convention Center looked like. And New York was right over there, and there was an aisle between them. And right there was Wisconsin governor. This was Wisconsin. Utah was over there. New Hampshire was over there. New York was right there. So I go over with our cameraman, John Hamilton, to interview Mr. Koch. And he is a tall man, a towering man. But he was sitting with other people, other delegates from New York. And I went over to ask him, I asked him, Mr. Koch, are you concerned that unchecked, concentrated wealth will subvert democracy? This was the question. Immediately, everyone around him stood up like a stand of trees that grew up in seconds, except for him. Now, when we tried to get the image of him on the Democracy Now! Website, all you see, I mean, he's a towering man, but he was cowering behind everyone. You only see his eye looking up. And everyone was there to protect him from any questions. So I asked the man who had stood up next to him, who reading his name tag, was Ed Cox. And Ed Cox is the chair of the New York Republican Party, and he's the son-in-law of the late President Richard Nixon, married to Tricia Cox, his daughter. And I asked Mr. Cox, are you concerned that unchecked concentrated wealth will subvert democracy? And he said no. So then I moved on down the aisle to ask other people questions. And I knew that aisle very well. Well, the night of the Mitt Romney address, the most important address of his political career, we were in the New Hampshire delegation talking to people. The big mystery speaker had made his speech, right? Totally remarkable. Delightful in the fact that it was the only unscripted moment. When he brings out this chair and said, clear it's Obama he has sitting in there, the invisible president, the underlying racism of this, Ralph Huddleston's invisible man. But then goes on to talk about Guantanamo, how President Obama had promised to close Guantanamo, and yet he hadn't done it. Now, a lot of people would agree with that, except they didn't expect to hear it from the stage of the Republican convention. And he went on to talk about how Obama was presiding over the longest war in U.S. history in Afghanistan. A lot of people would agree with that critique, and that Mitt Romney would pull them out the soldiers out the next morning. But again, from the floor of the Republican convention, I'm sure there was no one more shocked than Mitt Romney to hear this speech. And when that was over, then Mitt Romney comes out, and he was making his entrance from the back. We didn't know where he would be. And you see it on the big jumbotron on the stage. And you see, he's coming from the back. You can't see there are thousands of people, but you see him. And as I'm looking, I'm realizing, oh my gosh, he's coming down the path of the New York delegation, because I recognize Orrin Hatch's sneakers. I've interviewed all these guys so many times now for 3 days. In that aisle, I had bumped into Abe Lincoln. I am not kidding you, the day before. The guy who looked exactly like Abe Lincoln? He was a Missouri delegate. His name was George Engelbach. And he served with Todd Aiken in the state legislature. But he looked exactly like Abe Lincoln. He was wearing a top hat. All the media had interviewed him, but I realized he was a delegate, so he was worth talking to. And I went up to him and said, "Abe Lincoln, what's happened to your party?" But then, I said to him, I said, "Oh, well, you're a colleague of Todd Aiken's." He said, "Yes, I served with him in the state legislature." And I said, "What do you think of what he said?" And he said, "I think he should be forgiven for misspeaking." And I actually agree. I don't go for all this gaffe stuff. I mean, it's funny, but there's so many important things to do. If someone misspeaks, you have to just move beyond that. That's not the important issue. But I don't think Todd Aiken was misspeaking. He's expressing a whole school of thought that many have expressed, including Paul Ryan. And this is why it was so dangerous for the Republican Party. Right, he is the vice presidential nominee. He's not just signed legislation or supported legislation with Todd Aiken, he's co-sponsored legislation. For example, like the Sanctity of Life bill, which critics call the personhood bill, that says a fertilized egg is a person. So you have Ryan saying a fertilized egg is a person, and you have Mitt Romney saying that a corporation is a person. But I think we have to focus on the already born life and blood people that make up this country. But it is far more than that. And so I said to him, "Do you really think he misspoke?" And he said, "Well, yeah, when it comes to brutal rapes." And I said, "Well, is there another kind of rape?" And he said, "Well, certainly." Well, certainly. He says, when you're with a girl or a lady who's inebriated, or she's high on drugs, or you slip her a Mickey. And these are the conversations we were having on the floor of the Republican convention. So I knew this aisle very, very well. And so Mitt Romney's coming down, and I say to John, our videographer, "Okay, start filming the jumbotron, because it's showing him shaking hands with everyone coming down the aisle." And he said, no, we're going to get the poll feed later. We'll call New York. Robbie Karen, our video producer in New York, will get what all the journalists get, and it's the actual video feed, and we'll choose whatever we want. I said, "Film the jumbotron. You never know what you get when you're not there." All right, so he starts filming, and he's making his way down. I said, "Oh my gosh," so he's going to shake hands with David Koch. And that's just important to have. Of course he would. I mean, he's shaking hands with all of his supporters. He gets to David Koch, he shakes his hand, he puts his arm on his shoulder, he points at him, and he moves on. So we'll pull that and we'll show it the next day. And it is symbolic and it's real, and it's the Koch-Romney handshake. So we call Robbie at the end of the night and we say, pull that, by the way, from the pool field, because ours isn't as good quality, just filming a screen. And he says, film what? So I said, no, pull the film that you're getting from Reuters. That's when you see the New York poll, right after that, that's where all the New York delegates are. Maybe you don't recognize Mr. Koch, he's not a very public figure. A very tall man, and he said, no, he's not there. He said, hey, do you see Romney coming down the aisle? Yes, he's coming down the aisle, he's shaking everyone's hand. So what happens when he gets to New York? He said, it cuts away. He said it cuts away, and it cuts to these two young women, sort of look like they're high school, young college. They've got red, white, and blue boa feather scarves on, and they're very enthusiastic. And then it cuts to a big overview of the convention center. This all takes just about 5 seconds. And then it goes back to him shaking hands with the rest of the New York delegation, goes up on stage. So I said, are you serious? So we called Reuters, and we said, where'd you get that? I mean, now we're getting very technical. And they said, what do you mean? We give you our poll feed. I said, I know, but where did you get that? Did you direct that shot? No, they said. They got it from NBC that day, because each day a different network, is in charge. So that all the networks are not making a mess of things. You have one network, and they give it to everyone. They said, and who knows if that person was right, told us NBC, but then you have to ask, is NBC filming and choreographing it, deciding what the cuts will be, or are they getting it, just hooking into a box, and maybe the RNC is directing it and sending out that feed? We haven't figured out that part yet, and I'm not saying that this wasn't totally coincidental, but the world did not see that handshake unless you were watching Democracy Now! We put up a split screen. We showed Mitt Romney walking down the aisle, shaking hands with Mr. Koch and putting his arm around him, and we showed at the same time what the rest of the world saw, and millions were watching. Just as he comes up to Mr. Koch, he cuts away to these two young enthusiastic women wherever they were on the convention floor, a special close-up shot on them, and then a big shot of the convention, and then right back to the delegation as he went up on the stage. So if you want to check out the Koch-Romney handshake, go to democracynow.org. So we spent our time following the money. At the Democratic convention the first day, it was also quite something. It was pouring rain in Charlotte. I talked about Charlotte being this historic center of civil rights with the students marching on the lunch counters in 1960. What was that, like half a century ago? Well, something similar happened on the first day. Pouring rain. It's around 4 in the afternoon, and I get a text that something's about to happen on a particular corner. So I go over to that corner, and there are a couple of journalists there, mainly foreign reporters. And we see a bus come up, and it's the undocumented bus. And it's covered with butterflies, it's very brightly colored. And young and old get out of this bus. There were about 40 people who had come from Phoenix, Arizona, undocumented immigrants who were protesting the lack of a rational immigration policy in this country. They got out of the bus. And there was Maria Carrasco, who we had interviewed the day before on Democracy Now! And she was with her husband and her daughter. There was another young woman with her mother. Now it was families. And they looked like would be about to be arrested as I saw the police quickly moving in. And they start moving fast, and they're saying, no papers, no fear. No papers, no fear. But as they get out of the bus, they're very enthusiastic. And I'm speaking to Mari, and I'm speaking to Rosie, and a well-known pundit on the networks comes up to me, and he says, what's going on here? I said, well, it looks like these undocumented immigrants, something's going to happen. It looks like they're probably going to get arrested. What do they have to say? And I said, well, why don't you ask them? They're right here. I was interviewing Rosie. And he says, you just tell me quickly. And he says, tell me what they're saying. So I said, Rosie, would you tell this gentleman why you're out here? And she said, because I want to know what kind of legacy President Obama wants to leave. Does he want to be remembered as the president who deported more immigrants than any president in U.S. history? Or does he want to be on the side of the immigrant, she said. And suddenly, this pundit is writing this down in his notebook. Why it takes so much to get these pundits on all the networks. There's a small circle of them. They know so little about so much, explaining the world to us and getting it so wrong. Just open the microphone, pointing in the direction of the people who are making history. But hopefully he walked right off into his network chair and he maybe said something about this protest. And then they moved quicker. And they moved to the gates of the Democratic Convention. And they unfurled the banner that they all sat on. The rain was pouring down and the police were pouring in. This banner said, "No papers, no fear," and it had a huge butterfly on it. And I asked one of the women, "Why a butterfly?" And she said, "Because butterflies know no borders. Butterflies are free." And then, one by one, they started to get arrested. I saw this young woman with her arm tightly wrapped around her mother. And I said to her, "I bet you would qualify for this reprieve of President Obama, you know, the kind of executive order done through the Department of Homeland Security that says people 31 years or under who are immigrants who meet certain criteria can get a reprieve of deportation and work or go to school in this country. I bet you're one. We just learned today, I think, that they won't be able to get health care or anything, health coverage." And she said, "Well, I am, actually. But my mother can't. And if my mother's deported, I might as well go with her." And so one by one, they got arrested. Rosie and her husband, Martinez Huerta. I asked him, "Why are you getting arrested?" They were getting arrested for their daughter. And he said, "I have paid taxes in this country for 18 years, which is more than Citibank can say," he said. And so 10 of them got arrested on that first day of the convention. And these are the voices that I think clearly need to be heard that are making history, these movements. That brings me back to November 2008 as we move into this election year, and especially being here in Chicago. President Obama. You know, I think in November of 2008, the world heaved a sigh of relief when he was elected. I mean, no matter your political persuasion, it was historic. The first African-American elected in the country with a legacy of slavery. And the question is what happened after that, because the movements that came together to elect him, the anti-war movement, for example, I mean, I think that's why Senator Obama became President Obama. You very few differences between him and Hillary Clinton, except that she voted for the war in Iraq, and she held on to that to the very last second when she saw she was going down, and she said, "Maybe I kind of made a mistake." But he opposed that war. He never said he opposed the war in Afghanistan. I mean, all the different movements, the anti-war movement, the environmental movement, the gay and lesbian movement, all of these different movements that came together. But now the community organizer-in-chief became the commander-in-chief. And where did that leave community organizing in this country? Now, the good thing is parents all over this country can say to their kids, maybe you could be a community organizer too. But, so what happens then? President Obama makes a lot of very important promises, like to close Guantanamo, which he doesn't do. He then presides over the longest war in U.S. history, and it hasn't ended. More whistleblowers have been charged with espionage than under all presidents combined under the Obama administration. And these are high-level guys within the National Security Agency who are deeply concerned that this agency, that is a number of times larger than the CIA, is spying on the American people. Go back to 2008, the Denver Convention. I remember this well. It was about a year or months before the convention. Remember when the telecoms, Verizon and AT&T, were caught spying on the American people? Senator Obama put on his website he would filibuster any legislation that granted them retroactive immunity, and soon that was off his website, and then it was clear he was going to become the Democratic nominee. It was right before the convention, and he not only didn't filibuster, but he voted for it. And within weeks, we saw the Democrat delegate bags, and maybe some of you were delegates. They had AT&T plastered on both sides of the bags. big thank you party thrown by AT&T the first night of the Democratic Convention 2008. And in Charlotte, you know, we have to wear these lanyards that have our press credentials. They've got AT&T all over them. The telecoms are very thankful. But these national security officials are not, who have become whistleblowers and said that we are turning this whole spy apparatus on ourselves, and this is very dangerous. Makes me think about the remarkable crusading series by the Associated Press that just won the Pulitzer Prize this year for documenting under the Freedom of Information Act what the New York Police Department has been doing for years, spying on Muslims, not only and Arab Americans in New York, but they expanded to Connecticut and New Jersey. Unbeknownst, New Jersey officials say to them, the president of Yale University issued an angry statement saying, "How dare you spy on our students?" You know this story, and it's very frightening. We have the example because AP looked at the New York Police Department. What about all over this country? We had a young student on from the City University of New York who was named in the documents. He was a Muslim student. His parents said, do not go on TV, do not go on the radio, because you're going to target us. And he said, we're already targeting him. I have been named in these documents. He said, I think my only protection for all of us is to speak out. So he came on the show, and he was in the documents because he and his friends had gone on a camping trip for the weekend, and it turns out the guy who drove them was the infiltrator, worked for the New York Police Department, and wrote all about this camping trip that they had. And so he described it on Democracy Now! He said, they wrote that we're so extreme that we prayed 4 times a day. He said he was so stupid, he didn't know we prayed 5 times a day. But this level of surveillance is not good for any of us. I mean, even for the police. Police will tell you, the FBI will tell you, that when you have this level of surveillance that damages relations within communities, it makes it very hard to work with different communities if you want to be very practical about it. And all of this, whether we're talking about the charges of espionage, whether we're talking about Guantanamo, the war, the drone attacks, President Obama keeping, and this was exposed by the New York Times, the kill list and personally signing off on the people who are killed in these drone strikes without trial, without charge. These are very serious issues. And where are the movements that were so active leading up to 2008 today? Well, there are many people who are working hard on these cases, but I think people felt after he was elected, first of all, people were exhausted, but also that they didn't want to contribute to the right-wing attack. For example, you know, the birther movement, and you know, saying you are other, you couldn't be from this country. And people lost their footing. But when the most powerful person on earth is sitting in the Oval Office, and those who are used to having the ear of the most powerful person on earth are whispering demands in his ear, if he can't point out the window and say, if I do that, they will storm the Bastille. If there's no one out there, he's in big trouble. And that's when he agrees with you. What about when you do not agree with him, but you want to make your views heard? This is the moment. This is the time that politicians and elected officials from the lowest levels of government to the highest have to listen. They want your vote. Yes, money is swamping and corrupting politics, but still votes matter. Yes, there's this whole push all over the country to disenfranchise many people, but votes matter. I mean, I have covered countries all over the world where people are gunned down when they go to the polls, but they still do. Voting matters. And in order to earn your vote, you have the right to make your demands. That's the way democracy works. We don't achieve democracy and then it just is a democracy. It is something that is accomplished every day. And if you don't fight for it, we lose it. And when the Obamas went to the White House, right before President Obama was elected, remember when they met with the Bushes and they gave them a tour of the White House? I was invited on CNN to talk about the moment. So I was in the CNN studios and I see the video of the Obamas walking in to the White House. And there's other pundits and other places and they're all jabbering about something. But I'm looking at them walking into, I said, wait, we have to take pause. This is Barack Hussein Obama and Michelle LaVaughn Robinson Obama. And they are about to live in the White House. Michelle LaVaughn Robinson Obama is the descendant of slaves. which means their daughters, Malia and Sasha, the descendants of slaves, are about to live in the White House, the most famous house on earth that was built by slaves. Let's just take pause. And it made me think of a house a couple hours from the White House, on the eastern shore of Maryland. We're going to go there again soon on this tour. That's where Frederick Douglass was born. Frederick Douglass, the greatest abolitionist of all time, great organizer, who, said power concedes nothing without a demand, it never has and it never will. Certainly something President Obama understands well. And he was enslaved as a youth and a teenager. And it might not surprise you to know he was a troublesome slave. So he was handed to a man named Ed Covey, who was called a slave breaker. His property was called Mount Misery. He tortured Douglass, he beat him, but Frederick Douglass fought back, escaped, went north, and changed the world. That property, Mount Misery, is owned by Donald Rumsfeld today. He bought it when he was Secretary of Defense in 2003 to be near his close friend, Vice President Dick Cheney. Mount Misery is Donald Rumsfeld's vacation home. And when I heard this, I was stunned. And I thought, I have to really go and see if this is true, or is this apocryphal or something. I'm a journalist, I have to see this with my own eyes. So Dennis and I headed down to St. Michael's, to the eastern shore of Maryland. And, well, I should say in New York, I like this little independent coffee house. And on the outside, it's this old red brick building. It says that David Ruggles, born a free black slave, had a printing press here, and Frederick Douglass, when he came north, took refuge here. Frederick Douglass, who started the North Star newspaper, very interesting, David Ruggles. Frederick Douglass saw the media as their form of liberation, their form of emancipation, because information is power. And so as we drive into St. Michael's, I think, I have no idea where Secretary of Defense Rumsfeld lives, and we were in a rush. I had to speak in Washington, D.C. So I see an organic coffee shop, and I think they will tell the truth. So we go inside, and they say, what would you like? I said, I'd like to know where Secretary Rumsfeld lives. So they said, oh, just go down the road, and you'll hit Mount Pleasant Road. Don't go down that road, make a right, another right, and you'll go down the road, and you'll hit Mount Misery Road, go down the road, and that's where he lives. So we're on to something, right? So we don't go down Mount Pleasant Road, and we make a right and another right. It seems we couldn't go right enough. And then we start to see the black tinted windows of the Secret Service SUV, and we know we've arrived. So I get out, and I pull out my little video camera, and I'm zooming in as they are zooming out. And I'm thinking, does Secretary Rumsfeld know the significance of this place? And sure enough, as I'm zooming in, I see that there is a stake in the ground right next to the driveway that says Mount Misery. So then we head off to this ancient black church, and it's Sunday morning, folks are gathered in the sanctuary, and I ask one, could you talk about the historic nature of this place? You have Frederick Douglass born here. He was then tortured and beaten at Mount Misery, and now Secretary Rumsfeld owns Mount Misery, and he's known for torture. And what do you think of all this? And she said, I can't comment right now, we're in church. So from Mount Misery to Mount Hope. I was speaking in Rochester, New York, and Mount Hope Cemetery is near there. And a young student came up to me after and said, can I take you to Mount Hope Cemetery? I'd like to show you Frederick Douglass's tombstone. And I said, well, I'm heading to Denver. It's in the middle of a snowstorm. I'm leaving at 6 in the morning. She said, I'll meet you there at 4. So I go over, and she's covered in snow in her parka. And we walk to this tombstone, and she brushes off the snowflake. She says, let me show you one other tombstone. Oh my gosh, I'm going to miss my plane. Please. Okay. So we go to the other side of the cemetery, and it's the tombstone of Susan B. Anthony, who's buried next to her sister. And I told the story at Wesleyan in Connecticut, and a woman said, did you go to Susan B. Anthony's house? Because next to it is not a statue of generals, but a statue of Susan B. Anthony and Frederick Douglass having tea together. See, they were not just allies, they were friends. Frederick Douglass was not just an abolitionist, but he was a great feminist. He seconded the resolution in 1848 of the Women's Rights Convention in Seneca Falls for women's right to vote. And Susan B. Anthony supported the anti-slavery movement. She was not just a great women's rights activist and suffragist. These are the movements that have made this country great. And I headed to the airport, and I missed my plane. So I called Dennis quickly, you gotta get me on the next plane to Denver. He brings up, he is a fantastic researcher, he brings up the blueprints of the Rochester airport, and he says, are you in the Susan B. Anthony wing or the Frederick Douglass? I said, oh, come on, he said, I'm not kidding. And I see in the ground, it says Susan B. Anthony, and the other one says Frederick Douglass. You know, every once in a while you have to stop and smell the coffee. These movements, the women's rights movement, the suffrage movement, the civil rights movement, these are the movements that have made our country. And I always, when I come here, tell two other stories, and I want to tell them here. Quickly, Rosa Parks, and the reason why I tell it is because the media gets that story wrong. You all know it, and this part they get right. December 1st, 1955, she sits down the bus in Montgomery, Alabama. She refuses to get up for a white passenger, and in so doing, she launches the modern-day civil rights movement. When she died, Democracy Now! Raced to Washington, D.C. She was the first African-American woman to lay in the Capitol Rotunda, and her body was brought to a Washington church before the big Detroit funeral. Thousands came in Washington, and there were speakers set up outside so you could hear what was going on inside. Oprah was there, Cicely Tyson was there. We were outside where it's often more interesting to be, and I interviewed a college freshman, a young woman. I said, why are you here? And she said, oh, I emailed my professors. I said, I won't be in class today. I'm going to get an education. We're in a college, right? I didn't say that. She said that. And I remember CNN distinctly telling the story of Rosa Parks. And the facts they got right. But then they said, Rosa Parks was a tired seamstress. She was no troublemaker. Rosa Parks was a first-class troublemaker. She knew exactly what she was doing when she sat down the bus. She was the secretary of the local NAACP. She worked under Edie Nixon. He came out of radical labor politics. He worked with A. Philip Randolph organizing the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters, the black conductors on the trains, thousands of them whose fathers had been enslaved. Some of they themselves had been former slaves. They were all called George. Their mothers didn't name them George, but they were named George for George Pullman, who owned the Pullman cars. And you could understand why they wanted to organize. And they brought in A. Philip Randolph. A. Philip Randolph went on to organize the 1963 March on Washington, the greatest organizer of the 20th century. Edie Nixon worked with him. He worked with Rosa Parks. They knew exactly what they were doing. She trained at the Highlander Center, black and white together, to most effectively strategize to change the laws of the South. She sat down on the bus before and refused to get up, as did other young women. You never know when the magic moment will come. But if you are involved in social change, in building a foundation, when that moment comes, you will help to make history, to determine the future. The media denigrates activists, but what can be more noble than dedicating your life to making the world a better place? And to show how brave Rosa was, we go back to the summer of 1955, right here in Chicago, to the story of Emmett Till. The 14-year-old African-American boy, whose mother, Amy Till, sends him to Money, Mississippi to get out of the city for the summer, to be with his aunt and uncle and cousins. And he's ripped out of bed in the middle of the night by a white mob. They said he wolf whistled at a white woman. And he ends up in the bottom of the Tallahatchie River. When his body was dredged up and sent back here to Chicago in a box, his mother, Mamie Till, did something incredibly courageous. She said she wanted the casket open for the wake and the funeral. She wanted the world to see the ravages of racism, the brutality of bigotry. Thousands of people passed by his casket and saw it. And then Jet Magazine and other black publications took photographs of his distended, mutilated head. And they were actually published, and they were seared into the history and consciousness of this country. Mamie Till had something very important to teach the press of today. Show the pictures. Show the images. Could you imagine if for just 1 week we saw the images of war every day on everyone's Facebook wall only talking about war? Every tweet, every Above the fold, surviving newspaper, a photograph and a story about a soldier dead and dying. Every top of every radio and TV newscast about a baby dead on the ground, or every single email written about a family maybe killed by a drone attack, or a woman with her legs blown off by cluster bombs. For just 1 week, Americans are a compassionate people. They would say, no, war is not the answer to conflict in the 21st century. And I just want to end back at the Egyptian Revolution with a young man named Karim Ahmed, who was imprisoned by the guard for 4 years for blogging against the state. He got out in Tahrir, and he was there. And then we heard, it was a few days before Mubarak was forced out, that he disappeared, that Karim Ahmed had disappeared, and that he had been walking away from the square and then no one saw him again. So Dennis and I were writing a column that week, and Dennis looked at Karim's blog. I was texting Sharif and saying, what happened to Karim Ahmed? And the blog is dedicated to Hans and Sophie Scholl. You know who Hans and Sophie Scholl are. They're the brother and sister in World War II, who, together with their professor in Germany, thought, what can we do in the face of the Nazi atrocity? They weren't German Jews, they were German Christians. But they thought, the best we can do is to get out information so the Germans will never be able to say we didn't know. They, together with their professor, other students and workers, formed the White Rose Collective, and they put out this series of pamphlets. And on the 4th pamphlet was written the words, we will not be silent. They distributed these pamphlets everywhere. In the middle of the night, they'd drop in a courtyard, in a schoolyard, in a marketplace, in an alleyway, and then Hans and Sophie and their professor were captured. They were charged, tried, convicted, and beheaded. But that philosophy, that motto, should be the Hippocratic oath of the media today. We will not be silent. Democracy.